The negotiation annex was a blister of light and polished stone, adrift in the bruised purple sky of a gas giant. Elara Moss sat at the table and felt the weight of every dead thing this room had ever hosted. Her clients, the Riven, did not believe in decoration. The walls were bare, the air was recycled until it tasted of metal, and the single window showed only the endless churn of ammonia clouds below. Across from her, the Merath diplomat shimmered. His name was Sevar. His skin was the color of abyssal silt, but it moved with a slow, rhythmic glow, pulses of soft blue light traveling from his throat down to his webbed fingers. The light ebbed and flowed like a tide, matching some inner rhythm Elara could not hear. She had read the briefing. The Riven wanted to strip mine a world called Kalos. That was the Merath homeworld, a place of deep oceans and living coral. The Riven sought rare earth elements locked in its crust. The Merath had asked for a stay, citing ecological collapse. Elara's job was to find a number, a transaction, a price for peace. She was a broker. She found the point where destruction became too expensive to pursue. She looked at Sevar and waited. The Merath did not speak aloud. Instead, they used a small device behind her ear, a neural implant that translated thought into meaning. Through the implant, she felt his name, Sevar, not as a sound, but as the shape of a wave breaking against a cliff. She felt his patience, vast and slow as an ocean current. She felt his refusal before he had even formed the words. Calyx, the Riven representative, broke the silence with a dry click of his mandibles. His body was all sharp angles, a skeleton of chitin and chrome wrapped in a dark, oil-slick cloak. He slid a data slate across the table. "The offer is final," he said. His voice was a rasp like stone grinding on stone. 300,000 credits paid in standard ingots. Resettlement costs are included. Elara did not touch the slate. She had seen the number. It was a pittance. It was an insult dressed in a ledger. She turned to Sevar. "You hear that?" Sevar's bioluminescent glow pulsed once, a slow, sad ripple. Then the telepathic contact deepened. She felt an image bloom behind her eyes. A deep ocean trench, so far down that sunlight had never touched it. And there, growing in the dark, was a forest of coral. It did not sit silent. It sang. The sensation was not sound but a vibration, a resonant hum that passed through the water and into the bones of everything that lived there. The song was old, layered, a chorus of generations singing at once. Elara's breath caught. The image was not a metaphor. It was a memory, Sevar's memory, and he had given it to her raw. Sevar's telepathic voice was serene, unyielding. "We do not sell our ancestors." Calyx clicked again, impatient. "Then you will be removed. The fleet is already en route. This is a courtesy, not a negotiation." Elara felt the familiar frustration rise in her chest. It was a hot, human thing, a flush of anger that the Merath could never replicate. To the galaxy, everything was a ledger. Resources, lives, entire ecosystems, all reduced to a column of numbers. The Riven saw coral as ore. The Merath saw it as a library of living song. She was the broker. She was supposed to find the middle ground. But she saw the shadow of war, and it was already stretching across the table. She stood up, the chair scraped against the polished stone. "This negotiation is tabled," she said. Calyx's mandibles twitched. "You have no authority to table anything, human. You are a hired voice, nothing more." "Then fire me," Elara said. She met his flat, compound eyes. "But while you're deciding, your fleet is already moving. I saw the approach vectors before I came in. You're not here to negotiate. You're here to deliver an ultimatum with a pretty bow on it." Calyx did not deny it. He simply turned his head, a slow, mechanical motion, and looked at Sevar. "The Merath will comply, or they will be adapted to a new environment." Sevar's glow did not flicker. His serenity was absolute, but Elara felt a new image press against her implant. A single word, shaped like a falling stone. "Worth." She left the room. Her footsteps echoed down the sterile corridor. The gravity was low, just enough to keep her boots on the deck, and she moved with the quick, economical stride of someone who had learned to leave bad rooms fast. She keyed her wristcom. "Bennett, you there?" Her pilot's voice crackled back, warm and dry. "Where else would I be? Sitting in a tin can over a gas giant, watching the paint peel. What's the word?" "The word is failure," Elara said. "Get the drive ready, the one that folds space. We're leaving." A pause. "We're jumping. From inside the gravity well, that's going to be a rough calc." "I know, do it anyway. I want to be gone before the Riven decide I'm a liability." She turned a corner and entered the small docking bay. Her ship, the Wayfarer's Det, sat squat and ugly against the sterile white lights. It was a converted cargo hauler, all scars and patched hull plates. It was not fast, it was not pretty, but it was hers. The boarding ramp groaned as she walked up. Inside, the air smelled of recycled grease and old coffee. Bennett was already at the console, his fingers dancing across a holographic interface. He was a thin man with a permanent squint, as if he was always looking at something too bright or too far away. "They're going to notice us spooling up," he said without turning. "Let them." Elara dropped into the co-pilot seat and pulled up the star chart. Kalos was a small blue dot, 3 jumps away. A water world, 98% ocean, with a single chain of volcanic islands breaking the surface. The Merath lived in the dark, in the deep, in the singing coral trenches. She needed to see it for herself. She needed to understand what the Riven were so eager to destroy. Bennett whistled low. "Elara, the Riven fleet is already at the jump point. Like right now, they're not waiting for a green light." She looked at the tactical display. A swarm of angular black ships, dozens of them clustered at the edge of the system. They were shaped like arrowheads, sharp and hungry. They were not here to talk. "Then we go around them," she said. "Jump to the Kalos' outer moon, a short hop. It'll put us behind their sensor net." "That's a blind jump. If I miscalibrate, we come out inside a planet." "Then don't miscalibrate." Bennett let out a long breath. He turned and looked at her, his squint deepening. "You're not going to sell them, are you? The Merath, you're not going to find a price." Elara was quiet for a moment. She thought of the singing choral. She thought of Sevar's memory, the vibration of a million voices in the deep. She thought of the Riven fleet, black and silent, waiting to turn a world into a quarry. "I'm going to find a better price," she said. "One the Riven can't afford." The fold drive hummed. The deck vibrated beneath her boots. The Wayfarer's Det groaned like a living thing. Elara closed her eyes and felt the cold thread of Sevar's telepathic presence one last time. A distant pulse, a warning, a plea. Then the universe folded, and they were gone. The choir sang, and Sevar was the song. His consciousness drifted through the warm, dark currents of the Kalos' home ocean, one voice among millions. The choir's harmony was not music in the human sense. It was a lattice of pure logic, threaded through with memory and shared intention. Every Merathi contributed their strand, and from that braid came consensus, purpose, identity. Sevar felt the weight of the human's presence like a pebble caught in his throat. She sat in her ship somewhere above the crushing deep, a vessel named the Wayfarer's Det. The choir had tasted her mind during the negotiation aboard the station. They had expected the usual silence, the flat gray nothing of beings who thought only in isolated boxes. Instead, they found a storm contained behind glass. Her emotions leaked through the imperfect walls of her thoughts. Sevar swam lower, descending past the bioluminescent forests where the youngest Merathi learned to weave their first threads into the choir. The coral pulsed with soft amber light, each polyp a tiny resonator. His people had cultivated these groves for 10,000 years. Every frond held a generation's worth of shared song. The human's mind was nothing like the choir. It was chaotic, unpredictable. Flashes of color erupted without warning. Temperatures spiked and plunged. She felt things in sharp, jagged bursts, and she did not seem to know how to control them. Sevar had expected a warrior. The choir had analyzed the Riven threat with cold precision. Calix, their diplomat, possessed a mind like a blade, narrow and sharp and utterly silent. The Riven did not broadcast. They simply calculated. That was a known quantity. The human was a variable. She was not a warrior, the choir concluded. She was a functionary, a facilitator of transactions. Her role was to balance ledgers and broker agreements. This was manageable. Sevar felt the consensus ripple through him. The choir had voted. The strategy was set. They would show her the void beacon. He turned in the water, his long body curving through a canyon of black rock. The beacon rested in the deepest trench, a place called Mariana's Echo, where pressure could crush steel and light had never touched. It was older than the Merath themselves. The device looked like a twisted knot of crystal and shadow. It generated the planet's unique psionic field, the very field that allowed the choir to exist. It was their soul. It was also a piece of forgotten galactic history. The choir reasoned that the Praxis Council, the governing body of this sector, would recognize the beacon's significance. They would declare Kalos a protected site. The Riven would be forced to withdraw their fleet. The Merath would survive. Sevar pulsed a query through the choir. He felt the hesitation, the thin thread of doubt woven through the consensus. The beacon was sacred. Showing it to an outsider, a human whose mind was a storm, was a violation of every tradition. But the alternative was annihilation. The choir's song shifted to a minor key. It was the sound of readiness, of bodies preparing for motion. Sevar felt the distant prickle of the Riven probes like needles skimming the ocean's surface. They were searching for weaknesses. They were mapping the currents, the coral forests, the cities carved into the seafloor. They would find the beacon eventually. Better to reveal it willingly, on their own terms. Sevar ascended toward the surface. The pressure lessened, and the darkness began to thin. He passed through a layer of phosphorescent plankton that turned the water into a field of green stars. The choir's song grew quieter here, thinned by the distance. He was moving toward the edge of the collective. A single thought pulsed from the choir's heart, aimed at him alone. "You carry our voice, do not let it break." Sevar acknowledged the command. He surfaced, his head breaching the water, and saw the human's ship hovering above the waves. The Wayfarer's debt was a small vessel, utilitarian, scarred by use. It did not belong to the Riven or the Praxis. It belonged only to her. He floated in the swell, waiting. The ship's hatch opened. A ramp extended, lowering toward the water. Elara Moss stood at the top, silhouetted against the interior lights. She wore a simple environmental suit, the helmet tucked under her arm. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. Sevar did not speak. He could not in the human way. But he extended a thread of thought toward her, a single concept. "Come." He felt her hesitation. Her mind flared with a burst of heat, something between fear and determination. Then she stepped onto the ramp and descended. The water was cold against her boots. Sevar watched her stop at the edge, the waves lapping at her ankles. She looked at him with those strange, focused eyes. "I'm listening," she said. Her voice was a vibration in the air, crude and inefficient, but the meaning was clear. Sevar sent another thread, this one longer. He showed her the descent, the pressure, the darkness. He showed her the canyon and the trench and the ancient device resting at the bottom. He showed her the history of the beacon, the weight of it, the sacredness. He showed her what the choir had voted to reveal. Elara's breath caught. Her mind flared with a cascade of colors, surprise and awe, and something that felt almost like grief. She understood, perhaps, what it cost them to share this. "Why?" she asked. Sevar considered the question. The choir debated for a fraction of a second, threads twisting and merging. Then they reached a consensus. He sent a single word into her mind. "Survival." She stared at him for a long moment. The waves rocked gently around her. The ship's engines hummed overhead. Then she nodded. "Take me down." Sevar turned and dove. He heard her follow, the splash of her body entering the water, the muffled sounds of her suit's systems adjusting to the pressure. She was clumsy, her movements inefficient, but she was here. She was willing. The choir sang behind him, a low and steady pulse. It was a song of hope, fragile and thin, but present. Sevar led the human deeper, into the dark, toward the heart of their world. The submersible descended through water that had never known sunlight. Its walls were not metal but a translucent membrane, veined with pulsing bioluminescence that cast soft green light across Elara's face. She sat in a seat that had grown from the floor, organic and warm, conforming to her body like a living hand. Sevar occupied the forward cavity, their elongated form draped across a cradle of tendrils. No hands touched controls. No instruments glowed. The Merath piloted through thought alone, their neural interface linking flesh to vessel as easily as a mind commands a limb. Elara watched the darkness press against the membrane. "How deep are we?" 3,000 meters below the surface, Sevar replied, their voice a direct transmission into her skull, soft and patient. "The pressure outside would collapse your vessels as easily as crumpling paper." Inside the cockpit, the air held steady. The walls flexed imperceptibly, absorbing the crushing weight of an entire ocean. Elara felt it in her chest, a steady pulse, rhythmic and deep, like a heart beating through the hull itself. She had never trusted the deep. Land people never did, but this was not the cold, indifferent abyss of Earth. This was Kalos, a world where every drop of water hummed with the choir's awareness. The pressure outside did not feel hostile. It felt like attention. The descent continued for another hour. Elara stopped counting the minutes. Her watch had died somewhere past the photic zone, overwhelmed by the Merath's ambient psionic field. Time became elastic, stretched thin by the monotony of eternal darkness. Then the trench floor appeared. It rose from the blackness like a scar in the planet's crust. Crystal formations jutted upward, jagged and raw, their surfaces shimmering with an internal light that had no source. And at the center of it all, embedded in the rock like a splinter in bone, sat the void beacon. Elara's breath caught. It was not a machine. She had expected cables, power conduits, some kind of housing. Instead, she saw a geometry that defied her eyes, angles that twisted into dimensions her brain refused to process. Light spilled from it in slow, curving arcs, but the light had no color she could name. It hurt to look at directly. It hurt more to look away. A hum rose through the hull. It was subaudible at first, a vibration that settled in her teeth and traveled down her spine. Then it grew louder, not in volume but in presence, as if the sound was becoming a physical thing pressing against her skin. "This is the beacon," Sevar said, their mental voice carrying a weight Elara had never heard before. "Reverence, fear, love. It does not speak to us in words, it listens to the spaces between spaces, the silences between thoughts, the gaps in the universe where nothing exists." Elara pressed her palm against the membrane wall. "What does it hear?" "Other gaps, other voices. The beacon is a bridge across a void that has no name. The choir was born from its song. We did not build it. We only learned to listen." She wanted to ask more. She wanted to understand how a piece of alien technology could create an entire collective consciousness, how a structure older than any Merath civilization could sit here in the dark, patient and humming, waiting for something no one had ever defined. The alarms saved her from the question. They came not as sound but as a psychic detonation, a spike of raw terror that slammed into her skull and set her teeth on edge. Sevar convulsed in their cradle. The submersible lurched sideways, its bioluminescence flaring red. "Sevar, what is it?" The Merath's thoughts came fractured, splintered by panic. "Riven, warships, they have breached orbit. Drop pods descending. They are coming for the beacon." Elara's blood went cold. "How many?" 16 warships, over 200 drop pods. They will be in the water within minutes." She looked at the beacon. Its light pulsed calmly, indifferent to the storm breaking overhead. The Riven had not come for territory. They had not come for resources. They had come for this, for the source of the choir itself. Her hand went to her comm. "Bennett, are you there?" The link crackled with static, then her pilot's voice cut through, sharp and tense. "Captain, I see it. The whole sky is burning. What are your orders?" Elara closed her eyes. She had one card left. One piece of contraband technology she had never intended to use, bought from a Praxis arms dealer on a station that did not officially exist. It was called a temporal anchor. The device created a localized stasis field, freezing everything within its radius in a single, eternal moment. It was untested. It was illegal. It could kill them all. "Bennett, I need you to deploy the anchor." Silence on the line. Then Bennett's voice, low and disbelieving. "Captain, that thing is a rumor. We don't even know if it works, and if it misfires." "Then we freeze forever." Elara's voice was steel. "But the Riven don't get the beacon. Deploy it now." "Elara, that is an order." She heard him swear. She heard the clatter of keys, the hum of a system booting up for the first time. Then Bennett's voice, resigned and terrified. "Anchor is live, activating in 3, 2, 1. The world turned gray. It happened so fast that Elara's brain could not process it. One moment she was breathing. The next, the air in her lungs stopped moving. The hum of the beacon cut off mid-cycle, its light frozen in a perfect, unmoving crescent. The submersible's bioluminescence held still, each pulse arrested mid-glow. She tried to move her hand. Nothing. She tried to turn her head. Her muscles refused, locked in place by a force that was not physical but temporal. She was awake. She was aware, but her body had become a statue. Panic clawed at her mind. She could not scream. She could not blink. Her heart had stopped beating, suspended between one contraction and the next. Sevar's eyes met hers. They were wide, luminous, and filled with a terror so pure it transcended species. The Merath's thoughts were still there, faint and trembling, a whisper against the frozen silence. "The anchor has taken the entire planet. We are trapped inside a single moment." Elara tried to speak. Her lips would not move. She tried to breathe. Her chest would not rise. She hung there, suspended in gray eternity, staring into the glowing eyes of an alien who had trusted her, and she felt the weight of every choice that had led her here. The drop pods hung in the water like frozen sculptures, their descent halted mid-streak. The beacon's light was caught mid-pulse. The entire ocean had become a photograph. And somewhere above, in the stillness of high orbit, Bennett was also frozen, his hand still reaching for a button he would never press. Elara Moss, human broker, could not even blink. But she could still think, and as the seconds stretched into an eternity that would never end, she began to plan. The silence was not the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. Sevar floated in a void where the choir had been. The countless voices of his ancestors, the hum of the coral forests, the gentle pressure of a million Merathi minds thinking in harmony, all of it was gone. The temporal anchor had not killed them. It had simply stopped them, frozen them mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-existence. His own thoughts rattled around inside his skull, like a loose stone in an empty chamber. He had never been alone, not truly. Every Merath born into the deep carried the choir with them, a constant background whisper of shared memory and collective reason. It was as natural as the water pressing against his skin. Now that water was still. The whisper was dead, and Sevar was a single, terrified creature trapped in a cage of his own mind. The human female was beside him. He could feel her through the physical connection of the submersible's hull. Their hands had touched the same membrane when the anchor activated. Now they were linked by proximity and terror, two animals caught in the same snare. Her mind was not silent. Sevar had experienced the choir's analysis of Elara Moss. They had described her as chaotic, emotional, a primitive functionary of a primitive species. They had been wrong. The choir had looked at a storm through a porthole and called it weather. Sevar was now standing in the hurricane. Grief. The word did not exist in the Merath lexicon as a discrete concept. The choir processed loss through ritual, through archive, through the slow absorption of pain into collective wisdom. A death was a transition. A memory was a continuation. There was no rupture. There was no scream. Elara Moss was screaming. Not with her mouth. Her body was locked in the amber of the anchor's field, one hand still pressed to the membrane, her face frozen in an expression of determined terror. But her mind was a wound that would not close. Sevar felt it bleeding into the space between them, a pressure wave of pure, undiluted anguish. She was thinking of a child. A daughter. The image came to Sevar in fragments, like shards of a broken shell drifting through dark water. A small face, round and soft, hair the color of dry earth. Eyes that held the same fierce light that now burned in Elara's frozen gaze. A name. He could not grasp the name. It slipped through his mental fingers, but the feeling behind it was unmistakable. This was not a memory of loss that had been processed and filed away. This was a wound that had never healed. It was raw and red and actively bleeding. Elara had not mourned this child. She had carried her like a stone in her chest, a weight she used to anchor herself against the galaxy's indifference. And now she was using it. Sevar recoiled, or tried to. There was nowhere to go. The temporal lock held him as surely as it held her. He could only float in the dead silence of his own mind and watch as the human did something impossible. She was fighting, not with psionic power. The Merath had spent millennia refining their collective consciousness, learning to shape the beacon's field with thought and will. Elara had none of that. Her technology was crude, a blunt instrument that had frozen an entire ocean world without discrimination. She had no finesse, no training, no understanding of the forces she had unleashed. But she had endurance. It was not a calm thing. It was not the serene acceptance the choir would have recommended. It was a desperate, clawing, agonizing refusal to surrender. Sevar felt it as a physical pressure, a heat building in the space between them. The human was pouring her grief into the lock, using it as fuel, burning herself alive to keep one tiny piece of herself moving. Her finger twitched. Sevar's mind went silent, not the silence of the anchor, a deeper silence, the silence of utter incomprehension. He had watched the choir analyze humanity. They had studied the galactic profiles, the first contact records, the fragmentary data from the Riven and the Praxis and the Illith. Every report agreed. Humans were weak, divided, emotionally unstable. Their brief flirtation with FTL had been a fluke. They were not a threat. They were not even an inconvenience. The profiles had not mentioned this. The human's finger twitched again. A millimeter, maybe less, but it was movement. Movement where movement should have been impossible. The temporal anchor was absolute. It did not negotiate. It did not permit exceptions. It was a wall of pure, unyielding stasis. And Elara Moss was scratching a line in its surface with her fingernail. Sevar felt the effort it cost her. Every twitch was a scream. Every millimeter was a year of pain. She was not fighting the anchor with strength. She was fighting it with refusal, a stubborn, irrational, bone-deep refusal to stop being herself. The choir would have called this inefficient. They would have recommended acceptance, a quiet surrender to the inevitable. They would have processed the experience, archived the data, and moved on. The choir was frozen. Sevar was not. For the first time in his life, he was grateful for his isolation. The choir could not see this. They could not analyze it, categorize it, reduce it to a data point. This was something that existed outside their framework. This was something that could not be calculated. The human's hand moved. Not much, a fraction of a fraction, but it moved, and Sevar felt the shift in the anchor's field, a hairline crack in the absolute. She was not breaking free. She was not even close. But she was bending the rules of physics through sheer, bloody-minded refusal. Sevar understood nothing about this species. Their technology was crude and devastating. Their minds were chaos given form. Their emotions were weapons they did not know how to aim. But their endurance was impossible. It defied every law of psionic energy, every principle of temporal mechanics, every assumption the galaxy had made about the hierarchy of life. The human was weeping. Not with tears. Her body was still locked, still frozen. But her mind was a river of grief, and that river was carving canyons through the silence. She was thinking of her daughter. She was thinking of a promise she had made. She was thinking of the word never, and she was refusing to let it define her. Sevar felt something stir in the dead cavity of his own mind. It was not the choir. The choir was still frozen, still locked in the amber of the anchor's field. But there was a resonance, a faint echo of connection. The human's grief was so loud, so raw, so active that it was bleeding into him. He could feel it in his bones. He could taste it in the water that had gone still around him. He did not understand it. He could not process it. The choir had no framework for this. The beacon had no protocol for this. The entire history of the Merath Deep had no precedent for a creature that could weaponize its own pain. But he understood one thing. The galaxy had made a terrible miscalculation. The human's finger twitched again. This time it curled. A fist. A tiny, defiant fist in the face of eternity. Sevar had no mouth to speak, no voice to cry out. But if he had, he would have warned them. He would have told the choir, the Riven, the Praxis, every species that had looked at humanity and seen easy prey. Do not touch them. Do not threaten them. Do not give them a reason to remember what they have lost. Because they will use it. And they will not stop until the universe is empty of everything but the echo of their grief. The silence did not last. It shattered like a dropped glass, and reality came rushing back with a violence that knocked Elara off her feet. The seabed trembled. A thunderclap of released energy rolled through the water, shaking the submersible around them. The temporal anchor had never been designed to hold an entire world. It had been a desperate gamble, and now the house was calling in its debts. Elara gasped, her lungs seized. Every muscle in her body screamed as if she had been running for hours. Her vision swam with afterimages of frozen light. Sevar floated beside her, motionless. His tentacles drifted limp. His eyes, those 4 black orbs, were wide and empty. He had felt the choir snap back into existence and then immediately go silent again. The empathic backlash had hit him like a wave. He was catatonic. The comms panel on Elara's wrist crackled to life. "Boss," Bennett's voice was ragged, urgent. "Boss, you there?" "I'm here," she coughed. "Status." "The dead is screaming, structural alarms. We lost atmosphere in cargo bay too, but that's not the problem." A pause. "The Riven mothership is moving into orbit. They're powering weapons. I think they're going to bombard the planet until the surface turns to molten glass." Standard tactic. Deny the resource to everyone. Burn the whole world so nobody could have it. The Riven had no use for Kalos. They just wanted to make sure the Merath could never use it either. Elara looked at Sevar, at the trembling of his tentacles, at the slow, broken rhythm of his breathing. She grabbed his arm. The contact was electric. Their minds, still loosely linked from the anchor's collapse, flared with connection. She felt his confusion, his grief, his terror. She felt the choir's absence like a missing tooth in his soul. She did not speak. She pushed. A raw blast of intent, a wall of meaning. She showed him her plan, not in words, in images, in feelings, in the shape of a desperate idea. She showed him the void beacon. Not as a tool for calling help. That was too slow, too diplomatic. The Riven would glass the planet before any fleet could arrive. She showed him how to use it to call for attention. A signal, a broadcast, a scream so loud and so chaotic that it would rip through every diplomatic and military channel in the sector. A packet of pure human emotional noise. Grief, rage, the defiant joy of survival. Everything the galaxy had dismissed as weakness, weaponized and amplified. She showed him the Riven breaking a broker's contract. The mercy of Kalos, a world of singing choral and ancient memory, about to be turned to ash. She showed him what would come next. Every vulture in the sector, every curious ancient race like the beings called Eqancients who were old as time itself, every rival of the Riven, invited right to their doorstep, drawn by a signal they could not ignore. It was not a weapon, it was a scandal, a public shaming broadcast to every power in the galaxy. Sevar's eyes focused, slowly, painfully. He understood. His mind touched hers, a single thought trembling with something like wonder, brutal, elegant. Then he turned. He swam toward the void beacon, his movements unsteady but purposeful. His tentacles found the crystalline surface. They pressed against it. His body went rigid. Access granted. The beacon hummed. The light within it shifted, deepening, resonating with a frequency that vibrated through Elara's bones. She felt the channel open, a door to nowhere and everywhere. She closed her eyes. She thought of her daughter. Not the death, not the grief, the life. The small, stubborn moments, the laugh that sounded like bells, the way she would grab Elara's finger and refuse to let go. The warmth of her small body pressed against Elara's chest. The fierce, irrational hope that she carried into every room. She poured it all into the broadcast. Then she poured in the anger, the rage at the galaxy that had reduced her grief to a line item, the fury at the Riven for treating life like currency, the white-hot hatred of every diplomat who had ever looked at her and seen a useful fool. Then she poured in the joy, the stubborn, defiant joy of being alive, of refusing to stop, of scratching movement into absolute stasis. The beacon amplified. The signal fired. It was not a whisper. It was a scream. A psychic shockwave wrapped in a data packet, carrying the full weight of a human soul in its most raw and unguarded state. It tore through the void, scattering across dimensions, brushing against minds that had never encountered anything like it. Elara collapsed. Her knees hit the seabed. Her hands pressed into the sediment. She was shaking. Every nerve in her body was singing with the aftermath of that broadcast. She had never felt so exposed, so naked, so alive. Sevar drifted down beside her. His tentacles brushed her shoulder, a tentative, trembling touch. It is done, he thought. We have thrown the stone. Now we wait for the ripples. The comms crackled again. Boss, Bennett's voice was different now, not panicked, curious. Something happening, the Riven mothership. It's not firing, it's just sitting there. I think they received the signal. Elara laughed, a broken, exhausted sound. Good, she said. Let them read it, let them all read it. She looked up at the darkness of the trench, at the impossible geometry of the beacon, at the alien beside her who had chosen to trust a chaotic, emotional human. Now we see who blinks first. The broadcast was not music, it was a volcano. Sevar felt it tear through him, a column of raw, bleeding sound that had no melody, no harmony, no structure the choir could parse. It was grief given form, a mother's memory of a small hand slipping from hers, a laugh that would never echo again, a love so vast and broken it had nowhere to go but outward. The Merath deep had songs for loss. They had rituals of collective mourning, gentle waves of shared sorrow that passed through the choir and dissolved into acceptance. This was not that. This was a wound held open, deliberately, stubbornly, refusing to scar. The Riven attack faltered. Sevar sensed it through the fractured remnants of the choir, which struggled to reform like scattered droplets seeking their ocean. The Riven commanders had felt the broadcast too. Their minds were not built for this. They were sharp, linear, transactional. They understood threats and resources and the cold calculus of conquest. They did not understand a sound that demanded nothing, offered nothing, and shattered their formations simply by existing. The submersible's displays flickered with incoming data. Bennett's voice crackled through the comms, strained but precise. Sevar, I'm reading a system-wide comm lockdown. The Praxis Council just declared an immediate ceasefire. Repeat, immediate ceasefire. They're ordering all vessels to stand down. Sevar turned his large eyes toward Elara. She was slumped against the console, her chest heaving, her face pale and slick with sweat. She had given everything. The human had poured herself empty into the beacon, and now she sat in the wreckage of her own making, trembling and small. The choir's song returned, weak at first, then stronger. But it was changed. It had absorbed a new chord, one that did not harmonize. It sat in the collective consciousness like a splinter, sharp and alien, refusing to be smoothed away. The choir had learned a new calculation. The variable was human sentiment. Its value was incalculable, and its weaponization was absolute. Sevar reached out with his mind, brushing against the edges of Elara's consciousness. She was too exhausted to shield herself. He felt the echo of her grief, still raw, still burning. But beneath it, he felt something else. A quiet, stubborn satisfaction. She had done what she came to do. "The Illith are sending a query," Bennett said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "They're asking about the, quote, interesting noise. They want to know if it's a new form of communication or a distress signal." Sevar did not respond. He was listening to something deeper. The Silith Collective, beings made of silicon and crystal who measured time in eons, had registered a statistical anomaly in local space-time. They were analyzing it, cataloging it, filing it away in their vast, indifferent libraries. They did not care about the broadcast itself. They cared only that it had never happened before, and that made it data worth keeping. And then, from the deepest void, came the Echo Ancients. Sevar felt them as a pulse, a single, reverberating wave of recognition that rolled through the beacon and into the choir. The Echo Ancients were beings of faded time, creatures who had existed before the Merath had learned to sing, before the stars had settled into their current patterns. They did not speak. They did not think in ways that could be understood, but they remembered. They remembered the beacon. They remembered its makers, a race so old their name had been lost to the eons. They remembered the purpose of the device, the quiet listening, the patient waiting. They did not remember anyone screaming through it. The pulse resonated through Sevar's mind, carrying a single, unmistakable emotion: curiosity. The Echo Ancients were interested. They had not been interested in anything for millennia. The Riven mothership halted its bombardment. Sevar felt the silence through the water, through the choir, through the very structure of the trench. The Riven were not a race that hesitated. They calculated, they acted, they conquered, but their cost analysis had changed. They were no longer facing the quiet extinction of a minor species. They were facing a galactic incident triggered by a race that was supposed to be weak. The humans' broadcast contained no threats, no demands, no ultimatums. It contained only truth, raw and unfiltered, a portrait of a mother's love and a mother's loss poured into the void for anyone to witness. It was more destabilizing than any weapon. You could negotiate with a threat. You could counter a demand. But how did you counter the truth? How did you fight against something that simply was? Sevar turned to Elara fully. She had not moved. Her head was bowed, her hands limp at her sides. She looked broken. She looked spent. But she was alive, and she had won. "Why?" Sevar asked, the thought slipping through their fading mental link. "Why did you do this? You did not know if it would work. You did not know if it would save your ship or your life or my people. You gave everything for a gamble." Elara lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse. Because she deserved to be heard. Sevar did not understand. The choir did not understand. The concept was alien, irrational, impossible to integrate into their systems of logic and consensus. But they felt it, all of them, through the beacon, through the broadcast, through the lingering echo of her voice in the water. The human had not fought for survival. She had not fought for territory or resources or strategic advantage. She had fought for the memory of a child who would never grow up, for a love that had no outlet, for a grief that would not be silenced. The choir's song shifted again, incorporating the new chord, learning to live with the dissonance. They would never be the same. The Merath deep had been touched by something vast and terrible and beautiful, and they could not unfeel it. Sevar reached out and placed his webbed hand on Elara's shoulder. She flinched, then relaxed, leaning into the touch. "The Riven are withdrawing," Bennett said, his voice thick with relief. "They're pulling back to the edge of the system. The Praxis Council is demanding a full accounting. We've got ships incoming from 3 different sectors. Whatever you did, it worked." Elara closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the bioluminescent glow of the beacon. "It worked," she whispered. Sevar felt the choir's agreement, 1,000 minds nodding as one. They had learned a new calculation. The variable was human sentiment. Its value was incalculable, and its weaponization was absolute. The galaxy would never be the same. The orbital annex had been scrubbed clean of the negotiation chamber's sterile silence. Now it hummed with bodies and voices, with the low thrum of translation nodes and the occasional hiss of atmosphere recyclers struggling to keep pace with so many different life forms breathing the same air. Elara Moss stood at the center of it all, her hands clasped behind her back, her face a mask of professional calm. She had worn her best suit, dark gray, clean lines, no jewelry except the small silver pin on her collar that marked her as an accredited broker. She had slept 6 hours last night. She had eaten breakfast. She had prepared for this moment like any other closing, and that preparation felt like a betrayal of everything she had done in the trench. A Praxis arbitrator floated near the far wall, its elongated body suspended in a field of amber light. Its face was featureless, a smooth oval of copper-colored skin that rippled when it spoke. Beside it, 2 Illith observers clicked their mandibles in rapid sequence, their compound eyes recording every movement in the room with insectal precision. The Illith were a species of hive-minded insectoids, known for their meticulous record-keeping. They had come to witness, not to participate. That was fine. Elara did not need their votes, but it was the Aquatic envoy that drew her attention. The being hovered near the chamber's viewport, a shifting mass of silver-gray filaments that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. It had not spoken since the proceedings began. It did not need to. Its presence alone was a statement. The oldest known species in the sector, awakened by a human scream, had come to watch the humans finish their work. Calyx stood opposite Elara, his chitinous plates folded tight against his body in a posture of submission that looked like it cost him years of his life. The Riven fleet had been halted, disarmed, and fined into operational bankruptcy. The Praxian Council had delivered the verdict with cold efficiency. 16 warships impounded, the mining claim voided, and a reparations schedule that would keep the Riven conglomerate in debt for the next 3 generations. Calyx had signed the document with a trembling claw. He had not looked at Elara once. She did not blame him. She would not have looked at herself either. Sevar floated near the chamber's entrance, his bioluminescent skin pulsing in slow waves of blue and violet. The Merath diplomat had recovered from the choir severance, but something in his eyes had changed. He watched the proceedings with a quiet intensity, his thoughts no longer broadcast to the collective but held close, private, like a wound he was still learning to carry alone. The Aquatic envoy shifted, its filaments brushing against the viewport's reinforced glass. The gesture drew silence from the room. Even the Illith stopped clicking. Elara stepped forward. She pulled a data slate from her jacket pocket and tapped it once. The room's main display flickered to life, showing a single document rendered in 4 languages. "The final accounting," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this part. "Per my contract with the Merath Collective, as witnessed and enforced by the Praxian Council of Arbitration, I, Elara Moss, registered broker, hereby present my fee for services rendered in the matter of the Riven Merath resource dispute." She paused. The silence was absolute. Item 1. Perpetual mining rights in the Kalos-adjacent asteroid belt, designated Sector 7-9er Gamma, to be held exclusively by the human government, the Terran Federation, in perpetuity, with no extraction caps and no third-party claims. The room did not react. This was expected. Item 2. A permanent seat on the Praxian Council's local sector governance board, to be occupied by a human representative of my choosing, with full voting privileges and veto authority over matters concerning resource allocation. Calyx's mandibles clicked once, a sound of quiet outrage. He did not speak. Item 3, Elara continued, her voice hardening slightly. A formal written apology from the Riven conglomerate to the human race, delivered in open council, acknowledging that the Riven attempted to violate a protected sovereign world without provocation, and that their actions were unjustified under galactic law. She lowered the data slate. She looked at Calyx directly for the first time. "The apology must be signed by your council chair. It must include the phrase unconditional regret. And it must be read aloud in basic, the common trade language, by your ambassador to the Praxian Council within 30 standard days." Calyx's chitin plates vibrated. He was shaking, not with fear, with fury barely contained. But he had signed the reparations document. He had no room to refuse. "The fee is accepted," he said. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible across the chamber. The Praxis arbitrator rippled its amber field once, a gesture of confirmation. The Illith resumed their clicking, recording the moment for their archives. The Aquatic envoy did not move. Elara tucked the data slate back into her pocket. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply turned and walked toward the chamber's exit, her footsteps steady on the metal floor. She was halfway to the door when she felt the touch in her mind. It was soft, hesitant, like a hand reaching through fog. She stopped. She turned. Sevar floated behind her, his bioluminescence pulsing slow and low, the color of deep water. His eyes met hers, and she felt the weight of his question before he formed it. Elara. She waited. The galaxy is asking, he thought, and his mental voice was quiet, fragile, like something that had been broken and was still learning to hold its shape. What was the source? The broadcast? The power? It was not Merath. It was not any species we have encountered. They want to know how a single human, alone, afraid, could shake the Echo-Ancients from their slumber. Elara looked at him. She thought of the trench. She thought of the cold pressure of the deep, the pulse of the beacon against her palm, the moment she had opened herself and poured everything she had into the dark. She thought of her daughter. Not the grief, not the raw, screaming wound she had weaponized in that moment of desperation. She thought of the small, warm weight of a child in her arms. She thought of laughter. She thought of bedtime stories and scraped knees and the way her daughter had looked at her like she was the center of the universe. That love had been the foundation. The fury was built on top of it. Without the love, the fury would have been hollow, meaningless, just noise. She gave Sevar a tired smile. It was an overdue invoice, she said. She did not explain further. She did not need to. Sevar's bioluminescence flickered once, a pulse of confusion, and then something else, a slow, dawning understanding that spread through his thoughts like light through water. She left him there, floating in the annex, surrounded by diplomats and arbitrators and ancient beings who had come to witness the end of a war, and found themselves asking a much harder question instead. The Wayfarer's debt sat in its berth, its hull still scarred from the emergency fold jump. Bennett stood at the base of the ramp, a data pad in his hand, his expression carefully neutral. He watched her approach and said nothing. "We're done here," she said. He nodded. He did not ask about the fee. He did not ask about the Riven or the Merath or the Echo-Ancients. He had been with her long enough to know when to ask questions and when to simply prepare the ship. She climbed the ramp. She walked through the cargo bay, past the sealed hatch where the atmosphere had bled out into vacuum, past the emergency patches that still glowed faintly with repair sealant. She made it to the bridge and dropped into the pilot's seat, letting the familiar weight of the controls ground her. Bennett followed. He settled into the co-pilot station and began the pre-flight sequence without being asked. "Fold drive is green," he said. "Gravity well is clear, no pursuit vectors detected." Elara stared at the forward viewport. The station hung before her, a glittering cage of light and metal, filled with beings who had spent the last week trying to understand what she had done. They would not understand. Not really. They would file reports and hold symposiums and debate the nature of human consciousness until their collective minds ran dry. But they would never truly grasp it. They had listed humanity as a liability. A weak, unknown species, barely 20 years into FTL, too emotional, too chaotic, too primitive to matter. They had looked at humans and seen a column of red ink, a risk to be managed, a resource to be exploited. They had been wrong. Elara placed her hand on the fold drive activation panel. She did not press it yet. She thought of her daughter, not with the crushing weight of grief, but with a quiet, enduring love that had always been there, even in the darkest moments. That love was the thing she had protected. That love was the thing she had used. She pressed the panel. The fold drive spun up, a deep hum that vibrated through the ship's frame. The stars outside the viewport stretched and bent, and the station vanished, replaced by the blue-white distortion of folded space. Elara leaned back in her seat. She closed her eyes. The next client would look at her differently. They would see her and remember the broadcast, the scream that had echoed through the void beacon and shaken the oldest minds in the galaxy. They would see her and calculate the cost of crossing a human who had nothing left to lose. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today she was going home.